Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 26th of April 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. And we'll be joined by live video Skype link by Alex Thompson, who's there in Holland. And he'll be reporting as part of Eastern Approaches. Now, the weather, we can tell you that a few flakes of snow, fluffing my lines there, have been falling in Holland. We had a little bit of snow here in Plymouth about half an hour ago. And across the country, well, it's cold in Rhondda. Brighton is not too bad, I think, and London's got a bit of sun. Global warming.
At work, yeah.
At work, yeah, there we go.
Alex, we're going to begin with Christopher Booker. He's suggesting global governance is making the EU irrelevant.
He is, Mike, but not in a good way. And the reason why it's not a good way is because global governance, which is an acceptable term for one world government, makes headway regardless of what the blocs are doing at regional level. The UN is the source of it all, with its tentacles pointing everywhere, its myriad agencies. And he gives a particular example of that, which I think we're going to put on screen now, which is Harriet Harman. She got the blame for it. But anyway, there's an Equality Act 2010. Now, forget the argument about disabled people. There's no one targeting disabled people at the UK column. The point is this, that they are an interest group with a legitimate concern about the rights of disabled people if the UK withdraws. And that's one of these trick arguments to keep us in the EU, right? But as he correctly points out here, the kind of last hurrah of Harriet Harman in the Labour government was this Equality Act. And even the EU's own website makes quite plain that it is UN member states' obligation. So that's everyone in the world, bar North Korea and a couple of Micronesian countries and the Vatican. Everyone in the world is obliged by their UN membership to ratify this UN convention as law. This process is called transposition, and it goes on at UN to regional bloc level before it goes from regional bloc level down to individual countries. So we will be transposing everything that the UN wishes us to, and unless we leave the UN.
Indeed, and this, of course, is one of the big topics on the UK column website. And if you go and have a look at in the menu for series, you'll find one entitled One World Governance. There's a whole series of articles there discussing exactly this issue. Alex, Sweden wants to leave in the case of a Brexit. Yes, go ahead.
It's a recommended site, this youractive.com, and here we don't see very much deep commentary on this website, but they do actually speak some impalatable truths. And as you see, this poll is not even by Eurobarometer, which is the EU's tame agency. It's by Comres, which is slightly less tainted than the others. And the idea is that the Swedes are doing this classic hide behind the Brits maneuver. The British are on point. And we've seen this a lot in NATO, when the Germans were on point, saying we don't want Georgia and Ukraine to have NATO membership in 2008, and all the other countries lined up behind them because they didn't want the diplomatic flack of saying it in their own right. They were glad that the Germans were saying it for them. That's what we're doing now towards pretty much all the Germanic countries. I see it every day in the Netherlands here, but also in countries like Sweden, which are far less Marxist than their own governments. The population is saying, I very much hope the Brits leave, because if they do, we have a pretext for leaving. Sorry about the thunderous hail here outside. It was sunny a few minutes ago.
Well, what about the Dutch? What's their attitude to this?
Well, the Dutch have a very explicit attitude of we wish the British well, and I saw this myself at the weekend. For source protection, I shall just say it's the number 2 of a Dutch political party who was having a one-to-one conversation with me at the weekend. And he said, he's a man with his head screwed on, and he said, Alex, I very much hope that you British manage to leave the EU. And I said, I'm glad to hear it. Now, when is your party going to start advocating the Dutch withdrawal from the EU? He said, we can't, Alex. I said, why don't you want to? He said, no, you don't understand. We can't, Alex. We are a province of Germany.
Wow.
And then, as I took a sharp intake of breath, I said, what does that mean then? He said, well, it means that if the Germans want out of the EU, maybe we will be allowed to leave the EU too.
And Alex, I've got to ask, what forms that bond? What is the lock on Holland that means that they can't move unless the Germans do?
It's geostrategic. The German view of Benelux is that the Dutch-speaking peoples are Western European and do not belong to the Germans' own cultural zone, which they call Mitteleuropa, Central Europe. And that's a true understanding because the Dutch, in their heart and soul, are just like us. But they're on the continent, and crucially, they have the infrastructure, especially the port of Rotterdam and the Belgians too in Antwerp, in Flanders. Those ports are absolutely crucial for German exports and imports and for military maneuvers if you're uniting the European Union as a continent. The Allies fought very fiercely over that part of the Western Netherlands and Northern Belgium in the Second World War because they knew, the Germans knew that if we captured Rotterdam and Antwerp again in 1944, which we eventually did, we would be able to force the heavy machinery and to push into Germany, and otherwise we couldn't. So they fought from island to island, very atrocious fighting, and flooded all the islands along the way. That's the history of it, and we have to go back even further, 101 years ago, 1915, to a book to explain what the Germans think of Benelux and why they can never let the Dutch free of this grip, because they need the Dutch for their infrastructure. You might say, oh, well, Hamburg has a port. Well, yes, it does, but it's a long way round. It's not economic for exporting and importing to Asia and Latin America. And the Dutch are just brilliant logisticians, which means in the end that apart from the bombing of Rotterdam in May 1940, which was horrible enough, but it remains quite limited, the Germans have deliberately never destroyed the Netherlands because they need it.
But just to press you, Alex, what is the hold that the Germans have got? The Germans may be saying, we don't want to let you go, etc. There must be a political or a financial or an economic hold. There's something they've got to presumably blackmail Dutch politicians.
They do, because as Mike Powell's quite correctly saying in the chat room, I don't think that many Dutch people think that there is a bond with Germany. Quite correct. They feel much more Anglo-American in their connections. But their business links are with Germany. And what keeps that going is that the Dutch multinationals, after the Second World War, through the Bilderberg Group, which was set up in the Netherlands, and particularly the companies of the level of Philips, decided that their future was with the European continent and with Germany. The blackmail is very much there. And as I told this politician who'd never heard of this stuff, you remember my first ever appearance, I talked about Joris Demmink, the former top civil servant at the Dutch Interior Ministry, who's wanted by Turkey for buggering boys. He'd vaguely heard of this guy, but when I went on to say there are people with detailed testimonies talking about Dutch, Belgian, and British royals being blackmailed by German intelligence agencies for pederasty, he didn't disbelieve it, but he said, Alex, I've never heard that in my life from the Dutch media, which again shows how touchingly naive even quite senior Dutch people are, that they believe their media.
Right.
Well, Alex, a moment ago you mentioned Mitteleuropa, and so let's talk about that and Friedrich Naumann.
Yes, here in lovely old Gothic script on the left is Friedrich Naumann's 1915 book, when the Germans had every confidence they were going to win the First World War because the Americans weren't in it, remember. Mitteleuropa, by Friedrich Naumann. And at the bottom you can see Berlin 1915. And in the upbeat mood of the first year, when they had lots of fresh blood, basically, the Germans were thinking, whether we have vanquished the British, and that year, by the way, the spirit of the war was very much, the British are arrogant and must be taught a lesson. This is the kind of Europe we shall have. And they managed to implement almost one bit of it, which was the corridor down to Kuwait, which Britain then, of course, took over after the war, so that they could avoid the Royal Navy blockading them in future and have their own oil and have their own naval empire, which was, of course, what the British and Americans wanted to avoid at all costs. But that map on the right-hand side there, which is the French translation of Mitteleuropa, l'Europe centrale, that shows it all. Take a very, very good look at that map. This is the zone of influence which Naumann said in 1915 must be held by Germany at all costs. The Baltic republics are there. Everything in Poland and Austro-Hungary is there. Very significantly, most of what then became Yugoslavia is there, particularly Croatia and Bosnia, later to become German client states. Hungary, so then subjugated to Austria and therefore German-speaking. Everything west of there, including Benelux and Denmark. That was what Germany must not let go, he said, whether it was officially sovereign or not. In fact, that book introduces a new concept of limited sovereignty. In medieval philosophy, that would be called suzerainty, that countries could declare themselves independent after the war, but still be in hoc to Germany to send cheap manpower and resources there. The Germans, you see, lack the labor force and the raw materials they need to be a world power.
And are these maps from that book?
They are not from that book, but they are a later reconstruction, although they are in German, of what Europe's future was. The title of this, which comes from a 1939 Polish journal, so there's a health warning on it. It might have been a bit of wishful or over-exaggeration by the Poles, who were worried about the Germans then. But here is Europas Zukunftskarte, the map of Europe's future between the wars, as imagined by the same strategists as Naumann in the First World War. And you can see that the Deutsches Kaiserreich, the German imperial empire, stretches from Benelux, where it does not formally include the Netherlands, because the Netherlands was already then dependent on them for trade. So they would be allowed nominal independence and the crown, which was later nobbled by sending Prince Bernhard to marry the lady who later became queen, to tie her into Nazi aims. But the Baltic and all that, that's there as directly ruled by Germany. And then you see, if they'd won the Second World War, the idea was that most of the British Isles, and you could see it perhaps more clearly in the right-hand side with the portrait format there, that's going to be a Deutsches Schutzgebiet, a German protectorate. But right there in the West Country, you can see that Cornwall and Devon are marked England. They, unlike the rest of England and Wales, are going to be allowed to be some kind of Arthurian post-English England, which is very interesting given the Cornish regionalisation and the heart of the southwest stuff.
And I noticed Scotland is independent as well.
Scotland is the Königreich Schottland, so the crown was going to be told, well, before 1603 you were a Scottish crown and not an English crown, the incumbents anyway, so up you go north of the border and rule Scotland, is the idea. And Ireland was then also going to become a kingdom. That was the plan.
What I find fascinating about this, Alex, is of course we have seen the EU court Cornwall over many years, to the extent that they pushed the idea of stannary parliaments coming back into Cornwall. And there was a particularly pernicious EU organisation called Frewen, which started at the end of the Second World War and was designed essentially to get in and control European nation states by divide and rule amongst various ethnic groups. And it was quite interesting to see how some of the quite well-respected Cornish councillors were sucked into the Frewen agenda.
Yes, because that's a classic European Union means of proceeding. Don't forget that if you read Booker and North's books, The Great Deception and The Castle of Lies, you will find that this was kept from the Germans. I see our Polish friend Benny in the chat room is saying that. He's lived in Germany before coming to Britain. And the German people don't understand that either. The Germans are not an imperialistic, nationalistic people. Quite the opposite. Their nation is now the EU as far as they're concerned. It's the elite who believe this. And they're in my, I suppose, somewhat seasoned judgment now, they're no better or worse than the Anglo-American elite. Both groups are in there for world domination, using the same geostrategic thinking of Sir Halford Mackinder and other late Victorian geostrategists. It's just a question of who gets what slice of the pie, really. The agenda's the same, and the poor Dutch are caught there between the clashing rocks, with their sympathies westward to the Atlantic, but their business died in eastward.
Well, here is a picture of Friedrich Neumann, but the German Liberal Democrats seem to be quite in favour of the man.
To the extent that they call their think tank the Friedrich Naumann Stiftung, the Naumann Foundation. You may know that the German political parties each have a heavyweight think tank behind them, named after supposed heroes of German democracy. So the socialists have the Max Ebert Stiftung, the post-First World War Chancellor of Germany, and the so-called Christian Democrats have the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Now, Harry Becker, of course, revealed that Adenauer told him personally after the war that he had 150 Nazis stashed away just in his private office as Chancellor in Bonn. But the third party, the Freie Demokratische Partei, FDP, had Naumann as its visionary, and they've named their think tank after this mustachioed dreamer of a new Europe. And he actually inspired the FDP, which was always the junior partner in the coalitions. After the war, every time they had a coalition after an election, the FDP would be told, you have one senior cabinet post because of your showing of 10% or so. And they would always say, bags the foreign ministry, the Auswärtiges Amt, which meant that Naumann's, as it were, ideological child, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, which we'll talk about in a moment, was foreign minister for 18 years. And even then he could have carried on, but he was sick of it. And here is an example on the next slide of what this brought about. Look at the 2010 film, The Weight of Chains, where you can see that NATO in that slide, but it's the US and Germany, really, directed by Genscher, deliberately broke up Yugoslavia by very prematurely recognizing the independence of the two top left republics, Slovenia and Croatia, the pro-German puppet states, in the beginning of 1992. That was the last act, really, of Genscher, of the FDP party, before he shuffled off the stage. And the video is called The Weight of Chains, Tezina Lanaca. For disclosure, I should say it was funded by Australian Serbs. So it's obviously anti-Croat. But there's some shocking stuff in there about what the Germans and Americans did to use the Croats and Albanians, in fact, as client nations to break up Yugoslavia. Because, of course, the western side of Yugoslavia, the shore against the Adriatic, that must be a German area, which meant that the Serbs had to be broken off from Yugoslavia and weakened. It couldn't be an independent state threatening in the post-Cold War era to reassert itself as a successful economy.
Well, here is Genscher, and indeed, just to highlight this, on Wikipedia, they admit he played a key role in the breakup of Yugoslavia.
Yes, the sentence you've helpfully underlined there is he played a key role in the breakup of Yugoslavia. Go to his Wikipedia article because I'm not sorry to say he died a couple of weeks ago, end of March. And if you look at what he did in retirement, one of his last acts was to get to team up with Blair and our favourite Goldman Sachs man, Peter, what's his name? Sutcliffe, isn't it? The Sutherland, I beg your pardon.
Peter Sutherland, yeah.
To team up with them on some kind of board which was going to extract hydrocarbons from Kazakhstan. And you can't get much more geopolitical than that, can you? So when you get to that level, it's just a couple of German thinkers and a couple of Washington thinkers striving behind the scenes, using the same ideology to work out who's going to get to the oil fields first. That's all that's in it.
Yes. Okay, well, let's go for a complete change of subject now. And you wanted to comment on the Palmyra Arch?
Yes, well, I was in Palmyra in 2007 when Syria was just about still visitable, and I got the creeps from that place, although it was an undeniably majestic setting and amazing tombs to look at, for example. I mean, the first century Aramaic inscriptions there looked as though they'd been carved yesterday. The type was as clear as reading a page of a Hebrew Bible. It was so nice. But it's apparently all been blown up now, or at least this Arch of Baal has. And we've got this two-thirds replica that's been 3D printed in Italy and put up in some kind of tent in Trafalgar Square. But the opinion piece here by Juliet Samuel, who I'd recommend as an up-and-coming clear thinker in the Telegraph, some very interesting pieces in the last week by her, has quite rightly said, well, Palmyra is just like any other antique city. It was full of devil worship of various shades, repulsive slavery. Yes, it's romantic because they withstood the Romans, and Queen Zenobia, Zainab in Arabic, was carted off in chains because she wouldn't surrender to the Romans. So romantic stuff, but Palmyra is not the symbol of defiance of ISIS or Daesh or whatever you call it this week. It's just a symbol of ancient paganism, and it's been reinstalled there on Trafalgar Square, supposedly temporarily. Maybe this temporarily will be the same kind of temporarily as the French rollover of the constitutional prorogation.
And well, the other thing that was remarkable, wasn't it, to see Boris Johnson standing grinning under the arch. And the other fact is that it's been illuminated with blood red lights at night. So a number of people have commented that the thing looks particularly sinister at night time.
Not to put too fine a point on it on lunchtime news, it's a symbolisation of a bloodied birth canal when it's lit up in red, and it's also a symbolisation of what the Old Testament calls passing your children through the fire to Moloch. It's about child sacrifice to Satan. Johnson loves this kind of power play, doesn't he? I mean, in the last week he's called Obama basically a thick black man. Just one step more refined than that, half president, half Kenyan, or whatever it was he said. Johnson loves this kind of raw power stuff, although he's quite honed in his wording and got this Etonian eloquence to him. But then when the chance arises, he's there as quick as a flash to order water cannon, fully knowing that in Stuttgart they've blinded old men. He orders the same type and is promptly banned by Theresa May from using them, and journalists had to track down some warehouse in East London where they were being held. He loves the spirit of Palmyra, I think, which is thuggery.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting comment because we'll just say words that has come to the UK column over the last few years is that he is a dangerous man.
Indeed. Okay. Alex, we mentioned this photograph that you took, I think, yesterday. Give us a bit more on this.
Well, the title is Ahora Martina está más cerca de ser Super Martina. So now, after going to British Council lessons, little Martina is more certain of being Super Martina when she grows up. So there is this, what to me is a new outfit within the British Council, which itself is a kind of arm's length body of the Foreign Office, although they deny that. And this arm is called British Council Infants. British Council Infants. That's the thing now, and they organise these English classes. I saw in Madrid when I was there last week a lot of basically genteel poverty, a very noble people, the Spaniards, of course, so they don't want to show that too openly. But I saw that they're desperately trying to learn English and teach their kids English because basically they don't have much hope of their children getting a job in the Spain of the next 20 years. But maybe, just maybe, they'll go and be, with enough English, go and be a barista somewhere in a dive in a British town and then maybe marry out.
Yeah, and
It's sad.
it is quite sad. And but you have a couple of pictures here of
Yes.
Madrid.
And this is a bit shabbier in real life than it looks on the photo. And I didn't want to take any close-ups because the Spaniards are very noble people and they don't really like that kind of in-your-face camera business. But you can see that people are doing their best. And actually, would be a credit even to the Netherlands, probably the cleanest country I've ever been in that they do try to keep the streets scrubbed. But there's no hiding that in central Madrid, the paint's peeling, the parks are shabby, there's moss growing between the cracks. And yet, and this is a lesson for us as well, someone is I think that's an A3 down there in the corner, someone's bought a snazzy Audi, when clearly there's other priorities in a place like Madrid with these crumbling flats. But the Southern Europeans are really more like us than we think now. They spend far too much money on expensive German gadgets and gizmos for the sake of keeping up appearances. And the infrastructure is just peeling. I mean, my hotel room didn't have any working heating or cooling.
And just with an eye on time, what sort of reaction do you get from people in Spain about the EU? Were you able to get a bit of a feeling for that?
I have a paper which I brought back with me on the plane, which I'll perhaps just show you, because it's talking about the mayor of London. There we are, El Mundo, which is not as bad as El País. It's not completely globalist. El País is awful. But down the bottom there, you can see El alcalde de Londres se mofa de Obama por el Brexit. So the mayor of London mocks Obama for his position against Brexit. The Spaniards, unfortunately, even in their modest papers like El Mundo, the moderate, middle-of-the-road ones, have got this attitude: if the British leave the EU, they'll be cutting themselves off from the world. They don't have a free media, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Well, if the infrastructure is crumbling in Spain, it's doing more than that in Scotland. Now, of course, we covered this last Friday with David. But just to remind people, this is the fact that a number of schools in Scotland have had to close because bits of wall have been falling off and so on. And of course, these schools were built under a public finance initiative arrangement. And you wanted to comment on Britain's biggest PFI scheme, which of course was the donut.
Where I worked from the year when we moved in 2004 until the year I emigrated in 2009. And particularly in the early years there, it was a nightmare, I can assure you. And I wouldn't want to blame any of the individual staff on the consortium, which was a Group 4-led consortium called GSL, Group 4 Security Services Limited, I believe. They were all doing their best. And in fact, many of them were taken over lock, stock and barrel, like the existing dinner ladies were hived off into GSL. And then one year, UREST would get the catering contract and they would get UREST badges and uniforms. The next year, Sodexo would get the contract and they would put on a new set of uniforms. But the service, they tried to keep the same. But there was obviously no financial basis for the same services as before. That building has been leased to Her Majesty's government at an eye-watering monthly fee. It cost £3 billion to build. And HMG has the option in, if I remember the sums right, 2034. To buy the building outright when the 30-year lease expires. But until that time, they're paying an eye-watering number of millions per month for it. And I remember Prescott, not specifically talking about GCHQ, but PFI in general in the sort of mid-Labour years, saying to conference with this uncharacteristic bluster, well, if you want a house, you can't afford it today, but you want to live in it today. And it's just the same with PFI. So there he was admitting to his own party's conference that there was no money to build.
Yes. What can I say?
Just one more thing about that. It got to the stage with this GSL having a stranglehold on every meeting room, every piece of equipment in the building, that one day I wanted to put the rubber feet of my keyboard up a bit higher. So I tweaked it and it fell out. And then I called the repair line or whatever, which of course all this stuff is manned by GSL, the consortium running it. And I said, can I have a new foot for my keyboard, please? It's come off while I've been adjusting it. And I got a standard email back about half an hour later saying, there is no budget for keyboard replacement where user abuse has occurred.
Okay.
What can we say?
We can't say a lot to that. It will be a fascinating building to have a look inside, but I don't think I'm going to get an invite. Well, just a quick break to give you encouragement to attend the State of the Nation talk, which has kindly been put on by Penzance Truth Action, or will be put on the 7th of May. So if you're local to the West Country, we've just learnt that's England, according to the Germans
Yes.
and their dastardly plans. If you want to stay in free England, sorry about that if you're Cornish, but of course it was West Wales before that, so we can have a discussion. But that should be a very good event. Well, some shocking news which came via the Express, and that is apparently ISIS has almost put out a contract on our beloved Prime Minister. So here is the exclusive. Islamic State urges militants to kill David Cameron, and they're offering a reward. Now, I did mention this earlier on because I believe it was £200, or is it 140? No, it's 140 pounds. It's $200
Yeah.
is what's been put on David Cameron's head. Well, we just wanted to say to David, are these the good terrorists funded by the British and the US governments, or are they the bad ones funded by the Saudis?
They've got to be the British supported ones because they don't seem to have much budget.
Well, they're true, but they're quoting in dollars, so maybe they're used to handling the old greenback. So, and of course, the next point is that the UK column does not condone violence. So obviously, we couldn't support this call to kill the illustrious leader. We think that Islamic State militants should take him as a cuddly mascot, and they can cuddle him as much as they want. Alex, I'll just give you a quick comment on that because we pay billions of pounds in order to conduct state security, but apparently it's taken one of the major newspapers to discover that there's a plot to kill our very own Prime Minister. It's extraordinary.
It's a long time since the government has made a security announcement in its own name. And I think it was probably in the area of intelligence and security where the government started leaking things to tame journalists before any other area of policy. So you even saw during my time at GCHQ, the BBC security correspondent Gordon Carrera was allowed in to he wasn't given anything classified, but just to wow him basically, and then to give him some sort of handling time. I think that is what you've discovered in a number of cases, Brian. Papers are just given a bit of copy, and they're also breathless because it's got, from a classified source on it, or from an intelligence source, that they will produce it unthinkingly.
Yeah.
Well, interestingly enough, the Commons Foreign Policy Committee, or the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee, is examining the UK's role to see if we could do more to stop funds getting to ISIS, Daesh, whatever they are. Don't think they can decide. And this is taking place this afternoon in Portcullis House at 3:15. And it's going to be taking expert evidence from Air Vice Marshal Edward Stringer, CBE, who's the Cross Whitehall Senior Responsible Officer for Counter-Daesh Finance, apparently.
Counter-Daesh Finance?
Yes. And also Patrick Rardon, MBE, who is Counter-ISIL Finance Subject Matter Expert, currently consultant to the Ministry of Defence. So that's happening this afternoon. Maybe the subject of the contract on David Cameron will be one of the subjects for discussion.
Well, certainly they want to stop the funds to ISIL, otherwise they could use those funds to pay the contract, which would be tragic.
Yes.
Well, if David Cameron's in trouble there, let's remember, of course, that it was David Cameron and William Hague that were busy boasting about finances to some pretty dodgy groups in Libya. But a quite remarkable article here in the Telegraph by William Hague, Wicked Willie, as we like to call him. We can't now turn our backs on the chaos in the Middle East. What he's basically saying is, even though we smashed the country to pieces, it had to be done. This is one of the better quotes from that article. We intervened in Libya from the skies to save the inhabitants of that particular city from the vengeance Gaddafi had vowed to mete out on them on a far larger scale, and that we certainly achieved. Do you understand that statement, Mike?
I understand that this man must be off his head, Brian.
Well, I've called him low empathy because He's basically saying, never mind the death and destruction, it would have been worse without us. There's no proof of that, of course, at all. But never mind that, it doesn't matter how much we've destroyed, we're going to do more of the same. If we were criticising senior German leaders a little while ago, these people are dangerous sociopaths, low empathy people. What's your take on Mr. Hague, Alex?
I began thinking that he was going to save the Foreign Office because I was somewhat, right of centre then, and I thought that after that succession of awful Labour foreign ministers foreign secretaries who'd literally sold off the Foreign Office library and what have you, I thought that Hague would actually restore honour to the service. But no, he seems to have launched more wars than Blair's foreign secretaries did put together.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to TTIP because the government has published this little news story on their website, TTIP, separating myth from fact. And they say, as you can see there, this weekend, US President Barack Obama has been speaking about the progress on concluding negotiations on the EU-US Free Trade Agreement, otherwise known as the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And so they go through what they claim to be facts. And right at the end, we'll just scroll down to the bottom here, it says, TTIP is a threat to democracy. Big business will be able to sue the government and overturn UK laws. And this is, of course, the fact that they want to challenge. And so what they're saying is there's a misunderstanding that the Investor-State Dispute Settlement, ISDS, is a threat to our democracy. The purpose of investment provisions is to protect small and big businesses, individuals and pension funds from discriminatory or unfair treatment by a state. They are not about allowing foreign businesses to sue governments that pass laws which affect profits. The UK has over 90 bilateral investment treaties with other countries, and to date there has not been a single successful ISDS case brought against the UK. Now, I thought this was pretty strange because, well, first of all, it's a bit disingenuous because it implies that there have been several, but in fact there have been two. Right, so what are the two? Well, the first one that was the Channel Tunnel Group Limited. So Eurotunnel was complaining about the fact that the UK and the French governments, or they felt that the UK and the French government should be contributing a lot more to the security of the Eurotunnel on the basis of, as a result of the migration problem. Well, indeed, this was lost by the UK government, at least partially. So therefore, it's a bit strange that the UK government is saying that they have never lost an ISDS decision, because here's one that they did lose. And they ended up paying they ended up paying a share of 24 million euros with the French. So although this is defined as being a partial loss, it's because the tribunal didn't accept all the claims by Eurotunnel. They only accepted one mainly. And then the second case is this Indian lawyer who has been pursuing a claim or was pursuing a claim against the UK under the ISDS mechanism. And this was with regard to the India-UK bilateral trade agreement. In fact, this particular case highlights a slightly separate issue, but it's interesting nonetheless, because this was a gentleman called Ashok Shanchetti. He was a London-based lawyer of Indian nationality. He was bringing money in from India into the UK and investing in the UK, but he found himself in a disagreement with the Corporation of London because they claimed that he owed them rent, and they were pursuing that rent. But he was making a claim, and he was attempting to have this issue with the City of London sort of delayed until this claim was settled. And what was interesting was that in Ashok Shanchetti versus the United Kingdom, which was an ISDS-based claim, it says here, the claimant sought to stay court proceedings on the basis that it had filed a notice of arbitration under the UK-India bilateral trade agreement. The English court refused to grant the stay on the grounds that the Corporation of London was not party to the arbitration agreement and therefore wasn't part and parcel of, wouldn't come under the ISDS mechanism. So that's interesting in its own right. But nonetheless, Britain has only had 2 such cases brought against it so far. What is the situation more broadly? Well, more broadly, the situation is that ISDS cases have fallen in favour of the corporation 60% of the time, and in favour of the state 40% of the time. In the case of the UK government, they have lost 1 case, and the other case is apparently still up in the air, so that's about a 50-50 split. Nonetheless, they can't claim that they've never lost an ISDS case. And let's just remember that TTIP is absolutely part and parcel of the UK government's Best of Both Worlds document, our special status, as they call it, within a reformed European Union. It is right at the core of that policy. And so a vote to remain within the EU is a vote for TTIP, and therefore a vote for ISDS. Have you got any thoughts, Alex?
Just wants to read out Adrian P's comment from the chat box here. ISDS cases are held in camera and may not even be publicised, so there would be no public knowledge that the government had even been sued, let alone the amount of money involved.
Well, indeed, and that's why the case with Ashok Shantetti, it's a bit vague as to what the outcome was, because as far as I know, that outcome has never actually formally been published.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, in criminal law, nothing can be secret. In civil law, I don't know, I'm not enough of an expert on it, but the idea that HMG or the Crown effectively could be one party to what's effectively a civil dispute and say, well, there's no need for publicity here. That's doesn't sit very easily with English law, does it?
Not at all.
No, indeed. Okay, moving on. Policing and Crime Bill. This is at committee stage again, due to reach its report stage and the Legislative Grant Committee today. And they have issued a briefing paper on this. And I thought this was quite interesting because there have been some amendments put in through the Lords. So let's just have a look at what some of those are. They're going to one of the first amendment we'll talk about is reform to the Independent Police Complaints Commission, including renaming it to the Office of Police Conduct. So that's going to solve the problems of the IPCC, because we're going to give it a new name, and hopefully they won't take all the bad publicity they've had over the years with them. There's going to be a new offence of breach of pre-charge bail conditions, and this is relating to travel, and this is an anti-terrorism related situation, is what they're saying. A new offence for someone who owns a defectively deactivated weapon. So if they try to sell that on, that would be a new offence. But some interesting ones here. The particular 2 points that are interesting here. Police and crime commissioners becoming fire and rescue authorities and adopting the single employer model. So what we're looking at here is, under the Policing and Crime Bill, the merging of police and fire institutions. But the other aspect of this is new powers for police volunteers. And this was lobbied against by the Labour Party because they didn't want to see this. They were trying to prevent private contractors from getting additional powers, which would be give them the same powers of police constables. Volunteers also getting the same powers as police constables. Volunteers being placed in paid roles to replace those paid roles, and volunteers getting handed CS spray and PAVA spray. So the Labour Party trying to prevent those 4 things from happening, and we wait to see what the outcome of that grant committee stage would be. What are your thoughts, Alex?
CS and pepper spray, I've actually had tested on me. I was a volunteer in the other sense. As a GCHQ volunteer, to see how chemical warfare works, I went and exposed myself to it in a gas chamber. Exposed myself, maybe an unfortunate choice of words. I just took my gas mask off. And the idea that a volunteer could be spraying me in the face with that stuff it doesn't bear thinking about. I mean, the guys who are trained do it as an absolute minimum and last resort. And besides, what's their position? What's their standing in law? Can they be sued? Are they immune from civil prosecution?
Well, what this implies is that they would receive the same protection in law that a police constable has.
Which is, of course, that if they were reasonably doing their duties, then there's a presumption that they can't be sued, isn't there?
Yes, or at the very least, they're insured.
That is troubling. I mean, when you say volunteer, and saying we have to cut back on the paid positions and get the sworn officers down and have volunteers. I mean, to me, volunteers doing public duties that's appropriate for showing people around the cathedral because the verger's a bit busy. Now that's what a volunteer role should be. I mean, we could have an all-volunteer police force. We could go back to pre-Walpole policing, where all of us exercise our right to bear arms, which is constitutionally there in the Bill of Rights, of course, and we will volunteer to police the streets as and when we see trouble, and conduct people to the courts as necessary. Well, that's the ideal I would plead for. But if we have a professional police force, then they need to be sworn and accountable by name and number, which, by the way, they're not in countries like Denmark and Sweden. They will swear at you if you ask them to give you their name and number. They have no legal right to, legal obligation to do so.
I think we need to discuss this particular subject further on another occasion because we had the opportunity to go to a briefing by the prospective Police and Crime Commission candidates last night here in Plymouth. Very interesting it was too. Well, let's come on to the subject of children, and that brings us to Mr. Fallon. Well, we made it here, Mike, because here's the Express headline: child refugees face sexual abuse when we let them into UK, Lib Dem leader claims. Well, of course he didn't. The real headline was this: unless we let them in. And of course they failed the vote in Westminster last night. So what is he saying? Well, the reality for us is tens of thousands of children abused in the care of the British state, thousands stolen from their parents, and the government hides that abuse with the statistics black hole, which we're going to show in a moment. But Mr. Fallon is he's desperate for these children.
Yes, and of course he didn't really say this, but this is tantamount to what he said. 10,000 children have appeared across Europe. 10,000 children have disappeared across Europe. I want them to disappear here instead. Frankly, I don't care what happens to them so long as I can say I helped. I am a humanitarian. That's his attitude. So far, he has not given any response to anyone who has asked him the simple question, how will these children be protected if they were brought into this country? He refuses to answer that. I asked him again via Twitter today. That got no response, as you would imagine. So he absolutely denies any responsibility, it seems, through his silence for what happens to these children in this country. And so I think we can demonstrate a bit of that in a second. We
can. So that 10,000 figure is 10,000 out of 30,000 so-called refugee children that he's saying have disappeared.
Can we let Alex have a comment there?
In certain parts of the internet, the anti-feminist and anti-globalist parts, for a start, there is this concept of virtue signalling, which is that the new left, because the new right have their own vices, but the new left don't care what happens as long as they can signal in their actions and words that what they did was morally better than you. You see, this is virtue signaling, and Farron is just a living example of that. I mean, you've even coupled that incredible quotation where he says, "I don't care what happens as long as I can feel good about myself," to a picture in which he looks like a sixth form debater.
Yes, indeed.
Well, and remember that the German equivalent of this was Hans Dietrich Genscher. He was the leader of the German Liberal Democrats for, well, certainly many years, but foreign minister of Germany for 18 of those. And exactly the same, the radical middle. The third way, who cares whether you're left or right as long as you grab power? And who cares as long as you can feel good about what you're doing in the world? That's the spirit I'm feeling out of this.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, let's get to the reality of the statistics, because we've often said you just go for what the government doesn't want to tell you. So we went looking for the statistics on the number of children abused whilst in the British care system. Initially, we went to the Department of Education because they do produce a certain amount of statistics. But when we said, have you got the statistics on the number of children abused while they're being protected within the care system, they said, no, you should go to the Home Office. So we went to the Home Office, and here is their lovely reply. It says, Brian, unfortunately, we do not have any crime statistics which just cover abuse of children within the state childcare and protection system. So there you are. You have a system which can hoover up children they can be abused with impunity because nobody's looking at the stats. And we'll reinforce this. Now, I was only alerted to this the last couple of days, and I would like to see more. But a very interesting case here, Zimbabwean mother, and the boy in the video clip there, who's 16 years old, is apparently Desmond Tutu's son. And in trying to get a passport in this country, he ended up coming into conflict with social services, and they put him into a mental institution. When he got out of that, he rang for sanctuary to the embassy, and he's been in there with his mother, I believe, for about the last 3 weeks. That is all I know, but it's an extremely interesting case. But of course, it's showing that the British government doesn't care what nationality you are. If it can take the child, it will. And a little while ago, we covered the story here where a 5-day-old baby was taken from a Portuguese mother because, well, nobody knows why. The child was simply taken. So we say the situation in UK is now so bad that if you're here from overseas as a visitor or a tourist, your children are not safe.
Which probably explains, it may not justify, but it possibly explains this. Police hunting 2 masked men, shots fired at a children's services building in Manchester. This is a Manchester Council building, early on Sunday morning. Now, this happened at 4:30 a.m., so clearly there was no intention to harm any particular people. Whoever did this was wanting to make a point, perhaps. Police eventually attended the building at 7 a.m. on Monday, and they found bullet shell casings on the ground, damage to the door and brickwork of the building. Clearly a message being sent, they say that it is a targeted attack on a specific social worker. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I am not surprised that people are turning to violence because, of course, if you can't get justice in the courts, and you certainly can't in a family court, closed doors, no jury, perjury, false psychiatric reports, lies by social services, and judges who are simply prepared to take the child on that very poor evidence, where do people go? Eventually, they're going to turn on the authorities themselves. Maybe bullets aren't the way, but nevertheless, people are beginning to say, you're not going to have our children. Well, we can't look to the BBC, of course, for the truth on child abuse. Can we look to the BBC for truth on anything? We don't think so. Thank you for the viewer who said, have you seen this report? So, BBC Conspiracy Files, who shot down MH17? Now, I think there's going to be a programme on the 3rd of May about this. Please have a read because it is so appalling. Here we are, conspiracy theories swirl around many accidents, terror attacks or disaster. It's not surprising. A host of different claims surround the crash of Malaysian Airlines flight MH17. There are theories about fighter jets and different types of missiles. So what really happened? And I'll emphasise there that the last thing the BBC tell us is what really happened. What they do is blame it on the Russians. And this is one of the major paragraphs. There's all these conspiracy theories, but a British author who's worked in Russia for several years has traced how the Kremlin has adapted the doctrine of maskirovka or military deception for the digital age. Those nasty Russians have been working like a cult with non-stop conspiracy theories designed to confuse and bamboozle Russians so that critical thinking breaks down. This sounds like the BBC at work. Well, it goes on because you drag in Stephen Pfeiffer, former US ambassador to Ukraine, and he says major TV networks such as Russia Today are operating as an arm of the Kremlin and designed to put out a Russian propaganda line. Remember, this is the BBC speaking. So the BBC, biased, funded by the EU, It actually boasts of using subversive programs overseas, lied over Iraqi and Syrian weapons of mass destruction, and now the BBC has the cheek to accuse Russia Today of using propaganda. And we just re-emphasise that point. The last thing you find in the article is any evidence to support anything the BBC says whatsoever. Well, who's the man who's put it together? It's Mike Rudin. He doesn't appear to have a CV. He's a remarkable man. He's worked for the BBC, no background or qualification that I could find, but he was very big at ripping into the 9/11 story, took himself to America where he was unbelievably arrogant and aggressive with people talking about what witnesses actually said. This is some stills from this video clip. Here's the man himself, but very, very aggressive and arrogant. We're the BBC. We know what happened. We don't really want to know what people said who were witnesses on the ground.
Well, I mean, the BBC is so good, they knew what was going to happen, never mind what actually happened.
Anticipating
Yes.
Building 7. And let's remind people, here's his organisation, BBC Monitoring. Been going since 1939. I think, Alex, you might know a little bit about the happy partnership between BBC Monitoring and other monitoring stations. I'll give you a response on that in a second. But let's just remind our viewers that if you want to know what the BBC is really about, here is Juliet Harkin, former BBC Media Action charity project manager, boasting that they were able to use individuals in Syria who were working to bring the government down, and the BBC was there supporting them. Takes the biscuit, this organisation, Alex.
You know, it's the BBC's own GCHQ. I was given guided tours around as a GCHQ officer, and I have to say the atmosphere of the place and what people were doing at their desks looked more like a concerted effort to do signals intelligence than walking around GCHQ where people are doing signals intelligence. How does that work?
I think we'll leave that question hanging in the air because it's a very powerful question.
Okay, Alex, let's end with the book spot.
Yes, this is a Dutch author called Robin de Ruiter. If you're listening in audio only, his surname is DE space RUITER, Robin de Ruiter. And go for either the core book of his, which is Worldwide Evil and Misery, subtitle The Legacy of the 13 Satanic Bloodlines, or if you want his whole quadrilogy, it's called The 13 Satanic Bloodlines Paving the Road to Hell. Now, it's a bit of a shocking looking book art here, but despite the theological bent of it, which is maybe less if you order just the book Worldwide Evil and Misery, what it's doing is telling you that the top families, certainly in the Anglo-American side of the conspiracy, not so much the Dutch and German side, the Anglo-American top families do worship Satan, and they call him Lucifer, and it goes into a great deal of detail on what they believe about the coming of the Antichrist, who they believe is the savior. And even if you're an atheist watching this program, read this stuff because he really knows his stuff. And as he says explicitly in the book, what's important is knowing what's in these guys' heads, what they are told in these families from generation to generation. I've sat at Trinity College, Cambridge, at the feet of Emma Rothschild, who has been the biographer of the Rothschild family, getting a shiver down my spine as she was talking about empowering people. These kinds of people are born into this doctrine. And there's evidence that families of that ilk will actually bump off adult members of the family who haven't gone down that path. It's very, very, very dark. But Worldwide Evil and Misery, as the central bit of the quadrilogy, is worth reading its own right if you don't want the whole quadrilogy, because it will give you a fantastic amount of information. As often, it was published in Dutch first, or not often. As often, it was published outside the English-speaking world first. These books tend to be better often than books written originally in English. It's got a lot of information. The translation's not perfect, but it will give you a very good head start.
Okay, thank you for that. And of course, we'll just end on the fact it's a total coincidence against that background that the Palmyra Arch has been put up and illuminated red. Nothing to do with that at all. Mike?
I think we're done.
We're done. Alex, thank you very much for joining us. That's it for today. We will be back at the same time tomorrow. If you like what we do, please consider taking out a subscription or making a donation. We can only do what we do with your help and support. Thanks very much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.